Alright, time for another draft physics video presentation. Yes, it is recording, hopefully. I didn't reboot, which I really should do before making a video, but I didn't want to have to go re-find this piece of a comment section. So, on the Fermilab video, Dr. Lincoln, being a man, actually did respond to a comment by someone else. Troll, Farley, who knows, people who've changed their name from one name to another name, who knows what kind of person this is, a little fake newser of some kind, who knows. But whatever. One of the million of little fake accounts that people make, and they have conversations with themselves, and they pretend to be certain kinds of people and talk funny, just to make people look stupid. I mean, this tactic should be internationally, it should be just in the appalling category. And these people, like spammers, the liars, these people should be found. I mean, as a civilization, we should say, no, people who are stealing other people's identity and trying to make a certain group of people look stupid or retarded, these people should be found and they should be properly squished. And that's a metaphor, squishing. But yes, they should get what they deserve, okay, which is to get kicked out of the human race, because they can't behave like civilized, decent people. But anyway, that's a commentary. I'm throwing it in for free. If it offends you, too bad. Grow up. Anyway, I mean, every part of a human being isn't, a fun house. We all have anuses, There's going to be something about everybody that you're not going to like. Anyway, people are just so... Everything has to be explained to you. You people are so fucking dumb. Anyway, alright, there are a couple of points I wanted to make on the subject, so I'll get those over with. And there'll be other places where I will say something about physics, but I just wanted to get to these simple arguments first, just to be clear so people can understand and blah, 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 blah. So there's one outstanding thing that I could say, oh, this, if somebody would have just told me this 20 years ago, I could have just saved so much trouble. So we have the classic double slit pattern, okay, with the omissions in it, right? Okay, so you have bars, and then you have no bars, and then you have bars, and then you have no bars. And this is the big mystery. And again, they sort of implied that it's a forever pattern, when obviously the math sort of is predicting, quite obviously, the pattern on a radius. So the pattern is really, the math is predicting this radius. It's not predicting out here. And you could sort of understand that, okay, this is a mechanism, it has a finite number, it starts here, it doesn't start here, lots of things I've pointed out. But the most obvious thing for you to understand is, okay, here's a single slit, right? And here's a single slit. I draw one over here, right? Let's just say they're really, really far apart. And what's really happening when I make them a double slit experiment? I mean, is it really two single slit experiments, or is it something else? I mean, is what you see two single slits merging into each other, this, and so they're just less than a millimeter, right, away from each other, so they're shooting a pattern, and you're saying, well, the pattern has to be right next to each other, because this single slit makes a pattern, and this single slit makes the same pattern, and the two patterns are only a millimeter apart, so the worst it could be is a little blurry here, and a little blurry here, and a little blurry here, but it should be exactly the same pattern, because you're thinking about it wrong. Okay, so what the photons are actually seeing is you have to kind of think about it as the two experiments. One experiment is this, the single impediment. And the other experiment is this, okay, the single opening. Those are the two slit experiments you merged when you slid the two into each other. And if you understand that, then you can understand little bars being created here, okay, big fat bars being created here. So the envelope pattern, okay, is being created by the impediment, the closest distance between two surfaces, And the little pattern is being created by the wide distance of the outside surfaces. And that insight just explains, I mean, it just makes it so obvious how it's just two patterns dumped on top of each other. It's these two experiments done on top of each other. This experiment and then this experiment. Those are the two slit experiments that are being merged, not this one and this one. No, it's what they create when they merge is two different slit experiments. A very wide single slit. My other hand is over here. It's over here on the other side of the board. And a very narrow one. Okay, so those are the two experiments being merged, and if you understand that, it all just sits there and says right to you, oh, game over. And I combine that with the fact, oh, there's a certain number of nodes created. They start here, they finish here, okay, 1 millimeter apart, they finish, and we're just done. It's over. The mystery is all gone. It's clearly a surface phenomenon. Okay, the fringes are entirely dependent on the distance between surfaces because surfaces are creating the vectors. The pieces are being broken at the surfaces, and all you're doing is creating path length equalities, wavelength differences that are whole numbers, and at those points, bingo, you have a pattern. Where the two patterns overlap, you have pattern. 4 sources makes a photon. 2 sources doesn't work too good. 2 sources doesn't work too good. 4 sources, bingo, photon. That's the experiment. That's how you can understand it. It's just too simple. It's done. It's cooked. I've said it before. I don't know how a reasonable person, an honest intellectual, somebody who knows anything about math and geometry and function, how they could possibly deny that explains it really good. And waves at these locations explains it really bad. Alright, that's one thing I wanted to get to. Well, maybe I'll get to the, best to pause, erase, and come back refreshed. Alright, we'll do a little bit on single photons. Okay, let's do that first. So I have pointed out an explanation for the problems of single photons. So a smart person could know you can do a mathematical equation and figure out how big is a photon, and then I can do a calculation to say how many photons based on the energy I put in, 5 watts, how many photons can I expect, blah, 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 And that calculation will be based on some notion of what you think a photon is. So obviously I'm saying a photon is rather complex. I mean, it's got elements to it, and the elements are, this way, really. Okay, going this way. Okay, all parallel. Obviously this distance would be many wavelengths long. It wouldn't be just one wavelength long. And again, if they think a photon is instantaneous in terms of its interaction, that is, it hits and it only affects one electron and there's only one event, you could understand that they have a notion of what a photon is that could be infinitely small. So when they're putting it into the mathematics to figure out how many photons are in the experiment, obviously if they make the photon infinitesimally small, they can fit lots of them in there without them interfering with each other, without them being in the same location at the same time. So it really depends on what you think a photon is to do that calculation. And we'll say that all the people doing the experiment are assuming photons are infinitesimally small, and that's why they're saying, oh, I know only one of them is in the experiment. So as I've pointed out, so Dr. Lincoln does say in his video that the single electron experiment was done first, and I did ask him for a source because no, I don't think so. It was done in the early 1800s, and it was done with a gas light, okay, a little flame, and they put shields to block the photons, and they stopped putting shields when they didn't get any photons out. That is, they put a photographic paper and nothing happened. So when something happens on the paper, then they say, oh, that's enough shielding. All right, and then they put the 2 slit in, okay? And they do the experiment. The problem is, as I've pointed out, is if you do understand that photons are composite objects, these shields are really just a bunch of slit experiments. Okay, you're just taking the light and some pieces of it are making it through each shield. And so you're just diminishing the light by breaking the photons, taking the continuity of this object that is a photon, and you're saying, okay, let's just break this object into pieces. And then you're saying some of the pieces got through every single shield. Okay, they found a path without hitting an electron. All right. We know that atoms are made mostly of empty space. You can sort of understand that, yeah, it's possible that something actually has a path and it actually doesn't hit anything. And so you have a bunch of these coming out. Now they're not coming out straight, okay, because they are going to be affected by electrons. When they might hit one, deflect, and then make it, right? And make it, you know, through the goo of the next one. So they could hit something here and go this way. They could hit something here and go this way. They could hit something here and go that way. So the field is full of a bunch of these little bits moving all these different vectors. And now you're putting that into the two slit, which is going to deflect them one more time here at the surfaces. It's going to take some of those bits and it's going to do the same thing the two slit experiment does. It's taking broken pieces and it's going to break the broken pieces. And guess what? When it breaks the broken pieces, some of them will be able to land in the locations, and that's why with what you say are single photons, you have the pattern. But you're not going to get a pattern without there being the building blocks, the making material, the ingredients have to be hitting all these surfaces, or it just isn't going to happen. And the truth is, they don't have any empirical, you know, worthy of presenting to the king kind of evidence to prove that they did this single photon thing. It's just words they say. It's part of how they exaggerate the evidence. And you have to understand that's what they're doing. They're doing it overtly. They're saying they are convinced. They aren't saying there's good reason to be convinced. Okay, they're implying it, but they haven't demonstrated it. So it's really just a show. And it's just about whether they can convince you that this is really proven science. And it isn't proven science. Alright, there was some other subject. I'll have to think of what the hell it was before I move off from photons onto the other subjects. So, pause again. Diffraction. Yeah, that was the other one. So, this came up. Dr. Lincoln did in the video say, oh, we can't really talk about diffraction because that's too confusing. Well, it really isn't. And the reason why it doesn't get, they don't like to talk about it is because they're not understanding the word in the sense that they've stolen it, turned it into a word that you're only allowed to use if you're a wave theorist. You're not allowed to say diffraction as a way of saying scatter. So the idea of diffraction, okay, is now limited. So only if you're a wave person, that is, if you believe in wave spreading, okay, that is, the wave is going this way, and the wave is going this way, and the wave is going this way, and the wave, that's diffraction, the spreading of a wave, the creation of a wave, the initiation of a wave, okay, so essentially the single slit is supposed to be understood as like you're dropping a piece of water right here in the middle, and only this side is going, you know. And that's what diffraction is. It's just spreading, something getting wider and wider, as Professor Lewin would say. Now, obviously, there was a huge cheat in Dr. Lincoln's video where he said this is the single slit pattern. That's obviously only the single slit pattern if the slits are in Minnesota and Wyoming. You know, if the slit is wide open, yes, you get a little dot because there's no slits in the experiment. But with any surfaces of any kind of connection to each other, that is, if the laser can touch the surface, if the laser beam can get to the surfaces, there will be, okay, a spreading, a diffraction. And it has to be, frankly, you can't evade the mathematics I just showed you. And so there's going to be these other nodes, and the truth is you may not be able to see them. So when the experiment's done, I mean, Professor Lewin does it in his lectures live. I mean, he takes a laser, puts it through a variable slit, and you see it do it. You see it go from little bars next to this big bright middle, and you see it. You literally see it spread. That's diffraction is causing the spreading, but the spreading is only really, look at what is spreading. Oh, spreading is vectors essentially. I could just make the wave out of a bunch of vectors, right? That's a wave front. It looks like a wave. So just like a wave of bullets, I could fire a bunch of bullets, and yeah, it looks like a wave, but it would be kind of silly to say it's a wave because the bullets aren't really connected to each other. If I push on one pile of bullets, I don't push on all the bullets. Where we know water waves, if I push on this tension anywhere, I'll disturb the wave. I'll put a wave inside of the wave. You know, I'll cause all kinds of noise and disturbance because all the molecules are stuck to each other. It is a wave, where this really isn't. So I mean, diffraction is a key function for both the single slit and the double slit in the fact that diffraction is another way of saying the word scatter. You have to create the motion in all directions. And the real point is that the single slit in water or sound doesn't look anything like the single slit in light. Light creates a clear pattern, a clear, obvious, strong pattern. No doubt about it pattern. Water doesn't do that. I drop a single pebble in the water, it does this. It doesn't create any interference pattern. And if I put it through a sensible, if I take that water wave and I put it through a barrier at a normal speed, okay, it will travel right through and just make a new diffracting wave. There will not be any interference. So water is a terrible parallel to light if you're analyzing the single slit experiment. And that's the real truth. So they want to imply that it's just like sound and just like water, just like wave mediums, when of course it isn't just like. It's not really anything like. And it certainly isn't this. This is just a terrible fraud to say this is what the single slit does. It never does this. Again, unless the slits are in Wyoming and Oshkosh, Minnesota or something. It never happens. It always does this. And then these bars, like I say, when you start making this bar bigger, what are you really doing, right? You're back on the, the arced pattern. Okay, you have a certain number of nodes. And as you make the slits narrower and narrower, right? You went from really wide to narrower and narrower. What are you doing? You're just creating one big maxima because you only have one wavelength of difference, right? Once you get down to one wavelength of difference, all you have is one big maxima, right? But if you can see the pattern, if you can still see it, like in Professor Lewin's, you can still see it. It goes from here to here. It's about a foot long, and you don't see any of the other nodes. Well, that's because there's so little light because it's a tiny, tiny narrow slit. So those are getting lost because the light is diminishing, so it's getting so dim. But the truth is, those other patterns still were there, so his slit was still 5, 6, 7, 10 wavelengths wide. Because you really won't see any pattern if I make it a wavelength. And if I make it less than a wavelength, I can't get any pattern. It's impossible because, frankly, the photon's bigger, and you're going to break every single photon, and you're really having, you have so little chance of ever putting pieces together from so few photons. But anyway, the point is that it does get wider and wider, the diffraction. But diffraction has nothing to do with interference. Diffraction, this part of the wave, right? This does not create interference. The interference has to be created by having two vectors with the same whole number of wavelength difference. That's what creates the interference pattern. And again, I'm not arguing it's interference. I'm arguing the sensible argument, which is this is a broken piece, this is a broken piece, and all you do is reconstruct a photon by reconstructing the phase. All right. So now a little bit on gravitational lensing, just a real quickie, just as it comes up. So we'll get all of the physics over with, and then we can do the commentary on the commentators. You know, the rude and obnoxious. All right, so some guy's going to bring up, you know, lensing arguments, and even Dr. Lincoln brings it up, and it's just, you know, these terrible arguments people use. All right, so you have a gravitational body. Now, as I pointed out, the sun is not super gravity, okay? It's only 8 times, okay? It's only 8 times Earth gravity. It's 80 meters per second on the surface of the sun, and the Earth is 10. So just understand the sun is really lame in terms of how it produces gravity. You know, pretty lame. And it's only because it's, you know, the gigantic area it has, that gigantic circumference of the sun producing that 80, that makes it significant. So there's a little, this is a subtle technical argument to understand. So we have the inverse square law, which basically means something is spreading in both directions. So I'm shooting little paint drops this way, and I'm shooting paint drops this way. And you can understand if I'm spreading them both ways, that the paint falling on a surface will diminish, you know, the spreading of the surface will get smaller and smaller. So it's like the balloon getting blown up kind of thing. The surface is stretching in both directions, so the little dots are getting further and further apart if you put dots on the balloon at the inverse square. That is R squared rule. Now, if you're traveling through gravity, you're already traveling on one of those dimensions. You're traveling this way or you're traveling this way. So one of those dimensions you have undone, in a sense, the inverse square law, because the thing working for you is the further out you go, the longer you're in the paint, right? If I go past the sun really close, I'm only in the paint this long, right? It's a tiny amount of time I'm in the paint. But if I go out here, I'm in the paint a really long time. But the trick is the paint spreading that way. So I'm still in an R problem. I'm still going from, you know, 80 gravity here to 1 radius away, I'm down to 40. Now, if it was the inverse square law, I'd be down to 20, right? So I'd really be losing gravity fast. But it's 40 because of the distance I am from the sun. So the further distant I get, I help a little bit. But, you know, 3 solar radiuses, I'm down to 20, right? And then I'm down to 10. I'm down to Earth gravity at just 4 radiuses from the sun. 4 radiuses from the sun, I'm down to 10, I'm down to Earth gravity. I'm down to the same amount of gravity that Earth produces. Now the trick is how long you're in it again, right? And so we could say that, you know, obviously these distances get very long, you know, so it's definitely a quadratic equation. I mean, you definitely have to do the integral to figure out the change in the strength of the gravity at the longer distances. So it's not, you know, you can't make this an infinite line and say I was in the gravity an infinite amount of time. That would be ridiculous. So you're only in the strong gravity for a period of time that's not going to be that much bigger than the period of time here. So you're not gaining that much exposure. The exposure isn't, it can't overwhelm, again, the fact that the gravity is diminished. So in the argument, somebody's going to say that we've seen gravitational lensing 30 degrees from the sun, you know, which is hundreds of radiuses. Not possible, because at that distance from the sun, the lensing would be what you have on an asteroid. I mean, it would be a tiny amount of gravity. You know, we would see lensing by just looking at the moon, right? The moon has a nice dark edge, you know, most of the time, you know, except when it's a full moon. You can see the dark side anyway. So I'm just saying you could just take a telescope and look at a star behind the moon. If it was possible to do it with these tiny numbers. So just a few radiuses from the sun, you're already getting towards moon gravity. And all you're doing is, you know, expanding how long you're exposed to it. So you just double the number and say 12 radiuses from the sun. It's moon gravity. You think the moon can lens light? No. So, I mean, just makes that nonsensical assertion quite obviously nonsensical. All right, now I think that's enough introductory physics. I mean, the problem is, people don't know anything about these subjects, and they're just talking out of their little buttholes, and it's, I really have earned my right to talk by doing a ton of research in the last 10 years. I mean, a ton of it. And, people haven't done any of that, and they just talk what they've heard. Feynman says, I heard that guy, he got a Nobel Prize, and he said, and, it just doesn't mean anything because they haven't proven any of it. These things, again, these experiments have never been done. I guess I should have got to the detector experiments. I mean, but that one's so stupid that I shouldn't even have to draw that, right? The idea of passively detecting a photon. Oh, well, let's do it just because. If you don't, some idiot's going to say something stupid. But, there's just no... everything we see, because of light or some radiation we throw at it. So there's an object in space, we throw things at it, we see the reflections. And so it's all by, what we can reflect off of something is how we see it. Obviously, the thing we use is this energy stuff, the stuff moving the speed of light, photons, essentially. So we can throw photons at objects and see them. Now, obviously, there's no evidence that you can throw photons at photons and see the photon, okay? There's no evidence that any radiation bounces off of a photon while it's traveling. So the object is traveling, and we can bounce a photon off of it and see where it is. None of that is theoretically possible. That's what I said quite clearly, is it's not theoretically possible to do this. So why are these idiots saying, we did it? I mean, saying we did it when it's not even theoretically possible. You haven't even made an argument about how there's even a theory to do it. And even with electrons, there's just nothing we can throw at an electron to see an electron, because photons make electrons move. That's the whole point of the electrodynamics, is this fundamental truth. This is the Feynman diagram. There's no Feynman diagram that has electron. I hit it with a photon, a squiggly, and that's the end of the diagram. Or the diagram is the squiggly leaves like this, and the electron just stays there. There's no Feynman diagram for that. There's no possibility that you hit an electron and it just keeps going exactly where it was going and it doesn't care that you hit it. So there's absolutely no way to passively, without interrupting, without completely interrupting, without dramatically interrupting the activity of the object, to see it. It's like seeing us by shooting actual bullets at us. I'm walking down the sidewalk, you shoot bullets at me. You don't have some expectation that I just keep walking, you have some expectation that the momentum of the bullets moves me, and it moves me off the sidewalk and I get hit by a car. So, I mean, this is such a bad argument. It's terrible that Feynman talked about detector experiments. Again, how much sense does it make? This is a tiny slit. In the case of the electron microscope that they do the electron experiment in, right? This is something 1,000 times smaller than you could see, kind of stuff. You couldn't see this slit with your naked eye. It's so small. And you're going to put a little detector in here. You're going to shoot the field. You're going to fill the field with energy and get the reflections back. So you have a receiver and a source, and you're going to see the electron. You're going to build that little device right in here. Oh, get serious. You can't be this ludicrous and silly, people. I mean, I'm sorry. I mean, yeah, I'm mocking, and that's not my intent, but the assertion is idiotic, and you have no right to make it. And you can't keep saying, because Feynman implied that this experiment was done, does not change the theoretical impossibility of it. It can't be done. It's impossible to do it. So it's a moot and idiotic conversation. Again, even if you were going to have the conversation, so let's give them, okay, let's say I actually built it. And yes, it doesn't work, okay, but I did build it and I did try it. What would happen when I tried it? Well, obviously what would happen is I'll have a source producing energy, okay, that's going to hit my little moving thing. What's it going to do? Is it going to say, oh, when I had the detector on, it just kept going straight through? No. Obviously, the energy from the detector is going to push it this way, okay? It's not going to make it go straight through. So even the conclusion that when the detectors are on, there's no pattern and the light just goes straight through the slits. It's a ludicrous argument because your detector, the disturbance, obviously has a direction. You can't avoid that. And you obviously will move the pattern in that direction. So this is one of the ways you can know, of course, they didn't do the experiment, because if they did the experiment, this is the last thing that would happen. The last thing that would happen when you crash a Volkswagen into a Volkswagen is that both Volkswagens keep going the way they were going. That's the last result that's possible. Come on. This I shouldn't have to do. That's all I'm pointing out. I really shouldn't have to explain things that are theoretically nonsense. You know. And then to these people to keep asserting they have some evidence or it's been proven, and there's no evidence. Just like there's no evidence of so we'll do that one while I'm here, of the disappearing photon, okay? The other big giant lie of the experiment that you'll never find done. The only guy who's done it is a creationist, okay? And he did it by only showing you half the experiment. So he used a device that counts that takes the noise out of your photon signal, and actually what it was doing was taking the photons out of the photon signal, not the noise. So anyway, the only one that shows it in any kind of convincing way, like, oh, here I'm showing you, me doing the I can make photons, light plus light equals no light. I can make that happen. All right, so there's this argument in the two-slit experiment where they argue that when you cover one of the slits, there's going to be, this is the thing producing the pattern. So there's going to be places where, okay, it's a light spot here. And now, when I open this slit, magically, okay, this light spot goes dark. So this turns into a no photon at this same exact spot. That somehow by opening another slit, I made light disappear. Okay, so that's the argument, that they have done this experiment and proven this to be a real phenomenon. It's never been done. It's not, again, theoretical mush. And it doesn't work. It's not a real fact. And you can sort of understand why you can't make a photon disappear, I suppose. I mean, if it actually hits the surface. But anyway, but it certainly means that they're stuck with some law that says they actually are interfering here in space. Where again, the radar experiment, different experiments indicate that you're not interfering here in space. You're interfering at the target, if you're interfering at all. It's at the landing zone where the interference takes place. But anyway, so again, it's just part of the fabiology, is that if we can convince people that this experiment actually happened and you actually did this, it would be really convincing evidence. I mean, it certainly would be convincing evidence if you can make a photon disappear. I mean, that's pulling a rabbit out of the hat. I mean, that's doing something pretty, making a bird pop out of your sleeve. That's pretty impressive. But you don't have that trick. So why are you, they're describing what the magician can do. They're saying Jesus walked on the water, Jesus made lots of sandwiches for everybody, Jesus did this, Jesus did that. But there's no evidence that any of this stuff ever happened. Then any dead people started walking around. Alright. Yeah, that should be enough. Alright, so we'll just read some of this stuff and I will contextualize. So the irony was I posted a comment, didn't get any response. But it was really great that this guy posted this kind of snarky piece of shit comment, but it actually did provoke DrDon, and it appears to be him, to comment, which is, quite nice. So anyway, he says, is this guy a crank and a nutcase? Question mark. Yeah. And so it's a link to my video response to this video. And I said, I vote no. Seems like the right thing for me to do. Anyway, so then Don says, let's just say I have seen him start a 1920s car. So the irony here is, right, is that you have to be a better mechanic, a better engineer. You have to have more knowledge of the mechanical function of the car in 1920 than you do now. People who can start a 1920s car are more knowledgeable than people that can start a 2021 car. They don't even have to, you just hit a little button on your key now to start the car. You don't have to have any knowledge of anything. So that ridicule that I'm, a Newtonian, doesn't really work. Because if you think about it, it doesn't really work as an insult. Thank you for the compliment. And he has a restraining order against squirrels. So I guess that has to do with my hair. And I could call political correctness. You're not allowed to do that. So, but yes, I did make fun of his suit. So, we'll let you have that one for free. There is one point which I would semi-agree with him, is when I said I was ignoring diffraction. Yeah, and I heard you say it, okay? And you said you're ignoring it because it just adds a complication, and it really isn't that complicated. Diffraction is so simple that, that immediately struck me as, oh, here we go. Here's the dodge. Here's the evasion of the fact that water waves do not look like light at all in the single slit experiment. And that diffraction, there's no mechanism. So as I drew, right, there's no mechanism for interference patterns being created by something called diffraction. Diffraction doesn't describe things that create interference patterns, okay? So unless, you have to use your Huygens theory, where Huygens says there's an infinite number of new waves being created by every single wave front, and then you can do this kind of crap, and you can say they all cancel or some other horse shit. But you have to use diffraction in with some sort of bizarre information in, where you're making some assertion that there's a bunch of different waves being made. You can't draw the experiment this way, okay? Oh, and a wave comes out here in the two-slit experiment. You can't draw it that way 1 minute and then draw it this way the next minute. The next minute you say, no, there's a zillion waves in here, and they're all doing the... You can't have it both ways, and that's what you're doing here. You're playing a game where one model for one experiment, different model for the other experiment. That's called cheating, frankly. That's not the scientific method. The scientific method has controls. It has obligations to do the experiment in the same conditions. You can't prove, you're doing stuff like, I can make a comparison to like how he thinks witches float, because they're made out of wood. That's the kind of physics you're doing. It's really lame and idiotic if you get to change the fundamental model. You get to throw the witch in, and mineral oil is the same as water because it's, they're both wet, or some kind of stupid argument. You can't do that. I mean, that's not scientific. All right, he points out that the observed pattern differs from the truth because of the assumption used during the video. The point is you can't talk about the double slit experiment without understanding diffraction is what's causing the energy to move in different directions, but the interference thing is another part. The two things. Diffraction happens first, then the interference happens. They're two different functions. You can't say diffraction causes interference. That's not true. Alright, so he says, I will eventually make a diffraction video. There's no point in making a diffraction video because diffraction is such a simple concept. It's just spreading. And you can't make diffraction explain interference. To clarify, but it would only complicate the released video. So it wouldn't have complicated anything. And the reason why I'm frankly saying it overtly to you, the reason why you are avoiding the subject is because you're changing the rules. When you use the single slit, you have a set of rules. And then you're changing the rules when you describe the double slit. So you evaded diffraction by evading the single slit. Because you can't apply the same physics to both experiments and then explain reality. It's as obvious as the line I keep saying, that you have two waves in the single slit. That's the math. Two waves. Two vectors. How can you only have two waves in the double slit? There's two slits. There's two things happening. It has to be four waves. It has to be four vectors. You can't have two waves in the single slit, two vectors, and then say there's only two vectors in the double slit. It makes no sense. All right. So I'm comfortable with the assumption, even though pros need to deal with both diffraction and interference. They really don't. What they have to deal with is a pattern, okay? And the very fact that you're calling it interference is so presumptive because we're talking about what's causing an on-off pattern, a pattern. And it should be called the pattern until you prove its interference. And you aren't even close to doing that. All right, the rest of the video was, how shall I say, devoid of value. So the rest of the video was, in my opinion, snarky, you could argue. I threw in some shots. But the fact is, it was full of arguments pointing out how you have no proof of what you've asserted. And for him to just dismiss all of that was kind of lame. There's good arguments in the video, and you're just evading them. Okay. So he says, I also recommend you get yourself a beer or a glass of wine or something and look at the rest of his channel. Okay, so somehow maybe DrDon somehow did peruse some other video content. I'm not sure. Be sure to put a thick towel on your head to protect against the many face palms. So that's not even a good joke, because if I put a towel on my head and my face, I can't watch the video with a towel wrapped around my face. So that doesn't even make sense. You should have said put a towel on your head to protect your brain against the Dunning-Kruger radiation or something. I mean, that's not a very good joke. Sorry. Didn't hit the target very hard. It just kind of bounced off. All right, and Scott from Texas. I do like looking at his contrarian point of view. Okay, so we have to do the little acronym thing. See, that doesn't sound like Farley. So that doesn't sound like the Farley troll to me. But, like I said, Farley pretends to be all kinds of people. And his observations about how the appearance of the blending of the light around the sun. Regarding the Eddington experiment, there's also happening where there happens to be matter from the star. Well, the fact is that all of this stuff is an open question, right? Now, the new telescope they're making is using infrared because the argument is the universe is there's so much dirt in the universe that they have to use infrared for the new space telescope. To see through the dirt. So isn't that even part of the irony here? So you can make these arguments that the whole expansion theory is dependent on the idea that light photons don't ever hit any dirt. And yet there's so much dirt that we have to use infrared light to see through the dirt. See how the two things don't mix? The things far away could look far away, like they're moving fast away from us, merely because the light is redshifted, because it's constantly getting scattered by all the dirt. And all that scatter is creating a little tiny, every little scatter event creates a little bit tiny inflation of the frequency of the light. That's a proven fact. Compton scattering. See, I mean, it just opens all kinds of doors for speculation about how all these theories they tell you are the truth. All this stuff they say is definitely happening. There could be another simple answer, and they just don't care about other simple answers. All right. Let's see. Would that cause diffraction or just scattering? See, it's just kind of a funny concept. Diffraction from a rational bullet kind of shooter point of view is scattering. That's what scattering, if you do it in all directions, is diffraction. Okay, it's the same thing. They'll look exactly the same. Scattering particles will look just like diffracting a wave. Same thing. Okay, if diffraction, well, that can't be ignored. So yeah, it really doesn't sound like a Farley challenge. So DrDon answers the challenge. It's okay to listen to him, just as it's okay to listen to any of the tinfoil crowd. So this is another one of these, just these superficial slights that, because, like, you know, so all I have to do is find one MIT graduate who says something stupid, and then I can say all MIT graduates are stupid. I mean, this profiling kind of nonsense. I would agree there are tinfoil hat people. Okay, they're trying to do what Leibniz did, you know, the inventor of kinetic energy. They're trying to force their religion, okay? They're trying to force science to match their personal religion. And they're doing really bad science. Some of them are doing criminally bad science in the sense that they know it's a lie, they know it's fake, and they don't care. They want to mislead people. And then some of them are doing it because they're sincerely out of their fucking mind crazy. I'm sorry there's crazy people in the world, but I didn't invent them. And because you can't tell my house from their house, I don't live their way. Okay? And you really don't have a right to throw me in that crowd unless you want me to throw you into a crowd, like a Trumper or something. I'll just say you're a knee-jerker, or you're superficial in how you evaluate things. You know, blah, 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 blah. I mean, those kind of cheap insults don't do anybody any good. Anyway, but he's just wrong. Okay, so you say it, but I'm challenging you. I'm offering you $2,000 for us to have a little debate about who's right and who's wrong. Okay? And you can debate just my video. That's okay with me. I mean, I'd rather have a personal conversation and argue these details. But let's go see who's wrong. You get $2,000 regardless. You win the prize, the $2,000 prize. I lose the money, and I just get the opportunity to maybe prove you're talking out of your ass when you say that. You're not talking out of any kind of real knowledge, and I'll demonstrate it. And I'll put those words right back where they came from. All right? Yeah, and you're going to be uncomfortable. There is, in principle, diffraction from coming round the sun. Now, so obviously anything that goes through the sun's corona, the lamb of the sun, the dirtiest part, is going to have to be diffracted, in the sense it's going to have to hit all of that crap and be pushed by that momentum. However, the wavelength is so small compared to the sun that it's essentially irrelevant. So that's the part that just you can't make any sense out of. The wavelength of the sun? Yeah, sorry, I don't buy de Broglie. I don't buy that there's a de Broglie wavelength of an electron. I certainly don't believe the sun has a wavelength. Google RE disk if you want the particulars. So this just has to do with the fact that, as I've pointed out, there's two kinds of ways. You know, when you're diffracted at two different locations, you could look at the diffraction. You could say there's diffraction going in, okay, there's scatter that both goes in, and then there's scatter that goes out. And the obvious difference, okay, between the stuff going in and the stuff going out is the going out stuff can hit an infinite amount of locations, where the stuff going in can only hit a little tiny bit of space. I mean, infinitesimally small little bits of space are the only place all of the stuff that's diffracting in has to go to. You know, obviously the stuff that misses the surface you're looking at is going to go infinite again. You know, has a whole bunch of probabilities. But I just mean you're taking a little hunk of space. So you have 1 millimeter between two sources of diffraction. And you extend that 1 millimeter a mile away. And you say there's 1 millimeter a mile away. And there's going to be stuff coming from both locations that are going to hit that little tiny 1 millimeter. All right, that's hardly can be understood as having anything to do with the argument about the scatter that's going in all the other directions that are hitting bazillions of other locations in space. So it hardly is relevant to the conversation. All right. So then I point out, after he made this little snarkyism about my tinfoil hat wearing, you made many overtly wrong statements in your video. Now that's quite obvious. It seems you watched the video. I mean, so I shouldn't have to repeat these, but I just decided to repeat a few of them. The single slit, for example, does not create one dot of light unless the slit is thousands of wavelengths wide. That is, unless the slits are so wide that the whole laser beam just went straight through it, it's not going to create a round dot of light. There is no theoretical grounding for passively detecting an electron or a photon. I mean, I really shouldn't have to say this to a physicist. I mean, realistically, you clearly imply these experiments have been done. I mean, and that's a substantial mischaracterization of reality. I mean, that's what I would say is so close to being a lie. I don't know how you don't call it a lie. To imply that photons and electrons can be interacted with without affecting the proton or the electron is just doing ridiculous physics. It can't happen. All right, there are clearly two patterns in the double slit experiment, small bars and an envelope pattern. You ignored this feature entirely. I mean, it is the feature that makes the whole thing mean something. And he just ignored it entirely. The math compares two vectors in the single slit experiment. So this is the argument I just made a minute ago. And the math that works uses 4 vectors for the double slit experiment. Clearly, that's the reality. That's the math that works. The nth number math is the math that works. All the other math is a silly, it's not even a generalization. It doesn't really come close. Now, I really, see, this is where they for years fooled me, because I thought the math had some kind of integrity. We're talking about this kind of difference, right? I mean, identifying this distance and this distance, using this distance in the math, but pretending that you used 2 waves that were here, and they had a focus, it was here. So you're using this distance, but you're claiming you made 2 waves that would have a center here and here. That would be 1/2 this distance. And pretending that works when it doesn't. This won't work. This isn't the right pattern. This isn't the right distance. So that's the crime. And so in the double slit experiment, Young's diagram can't possibly work, because the centers, look where the center is. Here and here. You have to know that this distance, okay, is neither this distance or this distance. It's neither one of them. It's neither one of the actual slit experiments in the experiment. It can't get the right answer because it's the wrong distance, which means it makes the wrong size node. The experiment's going to make nodes that are this big and, say, this big. And this center math makes a node that's this big. All right, this and this cannot create the same pattern. All right. You clearly imply that the two-wave geometry gets correct answers. Obviously, by two-wave geometry, I'm saying with the wave center in the center of the opening. That geometry can't work. In predicting the double slit pattern, that's a clearly unproven assertion. So I'm just saying, yes, you'll never find somebody doing the experiment and that working, because it doesn't work. Okay, and so I say to him, I'm offering $2,000 play. I should have a 2 in there. This 15-minute video on your channel. Well, it's actually 17 minutes, but whatever. I will make you eat that tinfoil rag. Your video was misinformation and nonsense, and I'm quite certain I can prove it to a fairly intelligent jury. I mean, I hate that I have to qualify everything that I say about, because you just read these comments on these videos and you're just saying, man, these people really are dumb. People watching science content aren't very smart. But then I say to myself, but there's lots of people not commenting, right? And so the people not commenting will have to assume they're the smart ones. I don't comment on videos too often, so yeah, the smart people don't comment. That's the trick. That's the only hope we really have, frankly. That was interesting about the ARRI discs. I looked into it a bit, and in the context of photographic resolution. So we'll have to go look it up, but I'm fairly certain this just has to do with the two kinds of diffraction. You can bend light in or you can bend light out, and the two are different, but they both create pattern. All right. So Dr. Lincoln says, so this is his second channel. So he has a Doc Lincoln, a Doc Don and a Don Lincoln. Okay, anyway. Please rest assured that I will give your comments the attention they deserve. So, that's fair if it's meant without sarcasm. I acknowledge I was ignoring diffraction. Perhaps I said it too fast for you. So he's pretending that all of these arguments I made were about the fact that he cheated the word diffraction. No, that was one tiny piece of the video. And again, I could just go back and I could play the Professor Lewin clip where he's clearly saying, what grounding are you going to use to defend this idea that I'm going to call it diffraction in the single slit and then I'm going to call it interference in the double slit? I mean, Professor Lewin's clearly saying, whatever you want to call this thing, you have to call it the same thing. The same thing that's happening in the single slit is the same thing happening in the double slit. There's not two different kinds of mechanisms. The physics is the same. It's just silly to say one's diffraction and one's interference. It's silly. It doesn't make any sense. They're both making on-off patterns. It's the same physics. All right. So this isn't about that one subject. I was just pointing it out that you evaded the one subject because the one subject directly relates to the fact that water waves and sound do not create anything like a parallel in the single slit. There's a parallel in the double slit, a little vague parallel. It looks a little bit like, but it doesn't look anything like in the single slit. So water makes a lousy piece of evidence. Your seems like, looks like argument fails. And that's the part you were evading. Alright, so I say, pretending diffraction causes interference wasn't the only oversight in the video. You don't describe the actual experimental results at all accurately. They weren't small oversights, they are gigantic omissions. Richard Feynman made a mess of this subject 60 years ago. You are just reciting fables. And that's a true statement, frankly. If you watch my 15-minute video and you're at all honest man, you'll have to conclude the answer could be much simpler than you currently think. All right. And then I said, by the way. Okay, so this was another thing he said in his video, that somehow the first single experiment was performed with electrons. Huh? What? Anyway, by the way, what's the source for the assertion that single electron experiment was first? I've read papers published by the Royal Institution. I looked at the actual paper written by the actual scientists back in 18 whatever, and it's only 2 pages long. I mean, it's not a whole big detail. but it was like Hodge or somebody. It was like one of the guys who was really, you know, like the head of the institution after Rutherford or something. I mean, or Faraday. It was a real guy, okay? So it wasn't like some flunky or something. Describing the single photon experiment performed in the early 1800s with an oil lamp. Pretty big name physicist, as I remember, did the experiment. So anyway, I've actually seen, you know, a photocopy of the actual handwritten paper. So, you know, the question is, though, did they have any reasonable expectation? They did the experiment over a week. Okay, so they made a box, you know, a light sealed box. They put an oil lamp in it, put, you know, filters in, and then had a photographic plate. That's the experiment. And they gave it a week. All right, it wasn't just, you know, 5 minutes, wasn't 10 minutes, wasn't a day. They gave it a week for the photons to dribble through the experiment. All right, so it's, you know, it's a pretty impressive experiment in the sense that if you could actually argue that those are single photons. But again, the argument is that all the fact is until you create a photon source that actually just makes one photon, you can't filter the photons out, because any filter is doing exactly what I'm arguing is taking place in the experiment, which is you're breaking the photons. You're not destroying them, you're just breaking them. They're in pieces, and you're just going to put the pieces back together. All right. So then this real good troll, I mean, this is the real troll. Okay, this is Farley for sure. Regarding diffraction in the editing style experiment, there has been VLBM measurements that tracked objects all the way up to 30 degrees away from the sun. So 30 degrees is huge. Okay, so about 60 solar radii away. So that means there's a huge reduction in the gravity. And there's no way they could explain how you could have bending with that weak gravity. Weak gravity can't do bending. So it's just a silly assertion. If that's true, then you could argue we should be able to see light bend around the moon. Okay, faraway objects from the corona. His talk about the corona is yet another misleading. So I'm not the one doing the misleading, okay? People like you who pretend it's not a real thing, the corona. It's not it's not a real fact that little particles of material, atoms, even transparent ones, scatter light. It's a fact, and it's when you're misleading people into thinking isn't true. Okay. Another misleading lie he makes about these experiments. So obviously this is a crap comment. You won't be able to prove I've lied about a goddamn thing ever. So that's just bullshit. You don't seem to understand what is an illustration. So I guess he's talking to me now. Somehow illustrations are better than, you know, showing the real pattern. And again, the illustrations were horrible. This, you know, a single dot on the page is a silly illustration of the single slit pattern. It's not silly. It's just a terrible lie. Okay. The argument is still the same and unchanged. So which part of the argument is still the same and unchanged? That you did do detector experiments? Just link me to one. Because putting two single slit patterns on top of one another from the slits creates darker bands within the pattern. The darker bands aren't disputable. And the darker bands are from what cause is the point. My argument is if you actually measure the heat hitting the surface, you'll find that the darker bands are just as hot as the light bands. Because the fact is, just as much energy is hitting them. It's just that it's not in the form of a visible photon. It's in the form of a broken one. You have no explanation for the basic facts. So again, I've explained every single one of the basic facts. That's what every one of these videos contains, is that explanation. To say I have no explanation is like saying I'm not wearing a blue shirt. It's such a stupid lie. Anybody watching these videos knows they're full of explanations. I'm drawing on the board. I'm showing the mechanism. How could you say there's no way? I have no explanation. Of course I do. That's just moronic. That you seem to always evade acknowledging. So again, just complete nonsense. I've requested you send me a link to the physics you think is done right, and I'll show how it's overtly wrong. I'm not afraid of you, okay? I have an email address. You have some information or facts to provide. Show them. Link me to your facts. Link me to your leader. Show me the video explaining. See, some people say, Dr. Lincoln's really smart. He knows how to talk about, he's really expert on the double slit experiment. I just played his video. I'm clearly not afraid of his argument, am I? No. And I clearly ripped it a new asshole, frankly. I mean, I destroyed it. It's a piece of garbage. And I basically met the standard of proof. Again, if I could have a fair jury of reasonable men, and I mean men in terms of having something called integrity, people with integrity, there's no denying my arguments are valid. There's no denying the fact there's no evidence of detector experiments. There's no denying that there's no theoretical argument you can present me for how you can interact with an electron or a photon passively, that is, without disturbing its voyage. Show me how you can do that. It's like saying you can sail a boat without it interacting with the wind. Show me. Oh, and by the way, there is a way to detect photons, so this is just too stupid. And electrons passively. No, there isn't. I mean, you're asserting something that's just fucking so stupid. I mean, it's like, I don't even know. I could try to think of a retarded analogy. You know, there's a way of walking using your ears as feet. I don't think there is. If you just put a lot of thought into it. Yeah, I guess you're going to have to and make up a new universe where reality doesn't have to be met. Okay, anyway. Put one detector in one path and put no detector in the other path. And that means when the detector's on, you're passively interacting with a photon? No, that's not what it's going to mean, idiot. These experiments have been done, you complete idiot. So, dolt. No, they haven't. You have no evidence of them. You can't link me to them. No one's ever linked me to them. They don't exist. You cannot passively have any expectation of passively interacting with electrons and protons, and you clearly can't make any of these detectors small enough to even fit in the experiment, you retard. It's a fable. Grow up. Alright? There are no gingerbread people. Alright, so then he goes further. The math compares two vectors, so he's quoting me. In the single slit experiment, and the math that works uses 4 vectors for the double slit experiment. So I've already been over this in my videos. You know, I was the one, you know, the trolls forced me to deal with this Fontanar, you know, diffraction and all this other bullshit. So, you know, so yeah, and then when I realized, oh, when you really look at this math, what is it really doing? It's doing exactly what I'm arguing. See, they think it's wave math, and it's just vector math. So it works perfect for the scatter theory, because it's just vectors you're comparing. You're comparing a straight line from 2 locations, idiot. You're not comparing a wave front. All right, show us the single link, source page, anything that supports this made-up lie. So I could have linked to the Michael Van Briesen video, right, on the nth math. Or I could have linked to Professor Lewin doing the nth math. Okay, the math where it's an n number of slits. It works for a single slit. It works for 2 slits. It works for 50 million slits. That math really has 2 equations in it that are really just analyzing. Well, actually, it has as many equations as you have n's in it. And you have to do an integral for each one. I can make it much more simple for you by just saying it's easier if you just draw it and then measure it. Okay, because the math is more complicated than the drawing. But it's just vectors. And all you're doing is changing the n number, just becomes the number of sources. And it works. So it's n plus 1. So the two slit experiment is the two source, the single slit experiment, the N1 experiment is N plus 1, two source experiment. You just keep adding surfaces and, well, anyway. Show us a single link, so I linked him to the Wikipedia page on Fraunhofer diffraction equation, which is the four-source equation, which, again, they're using sine theta, and then they're multiplying it by pi and doing all this stuff, and you don't really have to do all that work. The multiplying by pi works because that tells you the curved line. It tells you the circumference on the curved line. But anyway, well, we've already been over that. It's a more detailed subject. It's in my videos I've made over the last 4 days, so if you're at all curious about that, fine, it's there. But his argument is stupid. I'm just saying it's a stupid argument because the videos are out there. The ones that really talk about the two-slit experiment in a serious manner all use the math that actually works, which is the diffraction gradient math. All right. So that's enough, right? More than enough, I'm afraid. So just this, it's just these, just the examples of stupid, are these people who comment, okay, when you reduce the experiment to one photon at a time, it's still creating an interference pattern. Therefore, it's interfering. Okay, and at the quantum level, there are no preferred directions of time, so both of the last two, the first photon, interfere with each other. If I were trying to understand QM, I would be looking to understand uncertainty in terms of time rather than position or momentum. It's just so bad. If I'm uncertain when or something happened, I'm also uncertain of its position. So, just this, if all these people just want the universe to be some kind of wacky place. I like this video because it gets down to the bare essentials. It evaded, the essential subject by evading the fact that the double slit creates two patterns, and it evaded the single slit in acknowledging there's a pattern at all. Just too funny. All right, well, I want to, there was a comment that was just really dumb, so. What is intelligent design intelligent design? Do we really want to go there? These are all just wooey people. Ken Wheeler types. It's just so depressing. But anyway, they actually saw some guy in this comment section bring up coaxial cable light. So obviously a Ken Wheeler reference. Light's like a coaxial cable. How can anybody ever make that make any sense? That one of the simplest forces in the universe is a coaxial cable. Seems like. No, it doesn't seem like that at all. I'm not getting it at all. That this, I look up at the sun and the sun is running a bunch of coaxial cable to me. Fuck. No, sorry, I depressed myself. Anyway, so that's enough of a video. This has been a DraftScience video presentation, and we'll see where it goes. It'd be nice if I can get the Lincoln guy to stay engaged and persuade him, that these are conversations that need to take place, that science has to be a lot more rigorous than this. You can't just claim things are proven when they're so far from proven. It's just not good science. Newton wouldn't like it. And that should mean, if I say Newton wouldn't like it, that should mean something to you. And you should say, ooh, if Newton wouldn't like it, maybe I shouldn't be doing it because, Newton was a pretty good physicist. Yeah. Come on. Anyway, till the next time.